To the January 2nd work session of the Salt Lake City Council. Chris is here, so the first item on our agenda will be the nomination of chair and vice chair for calendar year 2018, and then we will also be doing new seating assignments for 2018 as well. So at this point, I will turn the time over to our executive director, Cindy Gus-Jensen.
Okay, your policies call for time for anyone who is interested in the chair election. That's the one that's done first. So anyone that's interested in doing that, the policy calls for those people to have the opportunity to say a few words at this time.
Do we have to nominate?
No, you can just self-volunteer or nominate. You can do either one. Is this really loud?
No. Well, you're very quiet usually.
I'd like to nominate our colleague, council member Aaron Mendenhall. We've had some really great discussions with all of our colleagues over the last couple months about who would fill Stan's shoes. And, I think Aaron has, she's coming off of a really strong re-election. She's put in a lot of work over the last 4 years, and I think I'd like to support her in the leadership role of this body for the next year.
Thanks, Derek. These are loud. This is the beginning of my 5th year, and it's not my first try at leadership, but I feel honored that you nominate me, and I would be honored to have your support. I feel ready to do this, and I've situated my home and school life such that as best I can anticipate, I'm ready to represent us in that role as chair if you'll have me. We have, we've carried our priorities over from 2 years ago to last year, and I could see how we could continue with the priorities we had before because we still have a lot to do on streets particularly and some funding for officers, and these aren't going to be any small conversations. So I look forward to helping our newly elected members, if I get to sit in this role as chair, to help you find paths to bring your goals to fruition this year and kind of negotiate the space. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Nominate, if that's okay. I'm not going to nominate myself. We'll make it really easy. I'm going to nominate Charlie Luke, Councilmember Luke. The reason being is Erin has she's a fantastic council member, and I'm not going to slight her at all. I just have appreciated sitting next to you and learning from you. But for me personally, I think next year is going to be all about legislature. And for me, District 1 has too much to lose up at the legislature. So that's, for me personally, I know Charlie knows the ins and outs, working relationships up there, and just for me to feel comfortable over in District 1, I just feel it would be suited us as a council to have Charlie as the chair.
Thank you very much, James. I appreciate the support. Yeah, I mean, I definitely am interested in continuing in leadership to this next year as council chair. I do think that there has been a lot that we have set in motion that is not yet complete. I would like to see some of those items through to completion, and I think that this is a very important year, not only in Salt Lake City, but as James mentioned with the legislature and some of the issues that we're facing, especially with extraterritorial water rights. That is something that is of great concern, as well as the Northwest Quadrant and housing and some of the other issues that we've been talking about. So that's really why why I'm interested in moving forward. I do think that all of us are qualified for this job. It's not that I am uniquely qualified. I'm not saying that. I think Aaron is also very well qualified. But I do think that in light of the critical issues that we're going to be experiencing this year, figuring leadership out at this time is it's a risky move. I think Aaron can certainly do it. I think Amy, I think Chris, I think Andrew, Derek, James, all of us could do it. But I think that with the experience that I've had in leadership prior to this, does make it the right decision this year.
I will pass the ballots out. In order to follow the open meeting law, we do need you to put your names on the ballot. So you mark the person and list your name, and then the recorder and I will read those aloud. And for the audience, what happens after this is that the vote is ratified in the formal meeting. So the current vice chair continues to conduct until the ratification.
Your first meeting and you didn't bring a pen? Okay,
Don't-
that's only acceptable this one time.
Don't worry, Chris. It's been 4 years and I forgot a pen.
Okay, we have Derek Kitchen voting for Aaron Mendenhall. Andrew Johnston voting for Charlie Luke. Wharton voting for Aaron Mendenhall. Charlie Luke voting for Charlie Luke. Rogers voting for Charlie Luke. Voting for Aaron Mendenhall. Four votes for Aaron and 3 votes for Charlie. So Aaron Mendenhall will be the new chair for 2018.
Okay, so I don't know if you all heard that. It was kind of quiet, but there were 4 votes for Councilwoman Mendenhall for chair, 3 votes for Councilmember Charlie Luke. So Councilmember Mendenhall is our new chair. Congratulations. So it's a little bit different this year in that, this is really loud. I'm gonna put it way back, or either that or I need to whisper. So usually the way that leadership elections go, we'll have the person serving as chair continue in that role for the meeting. I would like to turn the time over to Councilmember Mendenhall and turn the chair over to her as soon as we are finished with the new seating assignments, though, so that you can jump right into this. So again, congratulations.
Okay, so now we have the vice chair ballots, and again, same thing, if people are interested or if you have nominations, now would be the time to speak up.
I'd like to make a nomination for Chris Wharton. And I hope I'm not surprising him with this nomination. It is his first day, but he has a pen now, so we're ready. We're ready to go. The vice chair position, working with the chair is going to be a learning curve for both of us in leadership. I think that you are well equipped to do this, and there are so many intersections in your district with the day in and day out work in the council. And I think that you're willing to do this, as we've talked about it before. And I think you'd be fabulous. It will be great to have new blood in our leadership on the council. And I hope we'll have a lot of open conversations with Charlie and with James, who have served in leadership in the past. but I think Chris will be a wonderful vice chair.
Any other, oh, yes. Yes.
Thank you for the nomination. We did talk earlier, and thank you so much for your confidence in me. And I'm happy and willing to serve. And either way, I hope that we can be a team that is transparent and that is open and that is drawing on all the talent that we have here. I'm just honored to be a part of this body, and but I can tell everyone that I will put my whole heart into this and jump in with both feet. I have my pen now, so I'm totally ready. Thank you very much for the nomination.
And the reason that we have this big pile of ballots is because there have been times in the past where it's had to go more than one round because there were like 3 or 4 candidates. So, we now have scrap paper.
Okay, we have Derek Kitchen voting for Chris Wharton, Andrew Johnston voting for Chris Wharton voting for Chris Wharton, James Rogers voting for Chris Wharton, Aaron Mendenhall voting for Chris Wharton, Amy Miller voting for Chris Wharton, and Charlie Luke voting for Chris Wharton. So Chris Wharton is the vice chair for 2018.
Okay, Cindy, do you want to continue with the chair positions?
Yes, where one sits. Okay, so
I have a suggestion. We go oldest to youngest. We talked about this as such a young council.
You want me right on the end, don't you? I know, at 44, the fact that I'm the oldest is just crazy, but...
okay, so the one way we've done this before is we have 5 numbers in this bowl. You just choose a number, and then the first person selects their seat. The chair and vice chair, chair sits here, vice chair sits there. So the chair and vice chair don't select a number. One is here. Oh, we will make that up in a. You get to choose, yeah.
Wait, so
Yeah.
who gets to go first, number 1 or number 5?
Number 1. That down to James.
Charlie, you were in the perfect position to just throw me into the deep end here. And we will get going with the second item on our agenda. An ordinance looking at property clearing and weed control abatements. I think we're gonna have Nick Tarbett and Orion or someone else. There's Orion. And if you're not on our list, please introduce yourself when you take a seat.
Would you like me to give a quick?
Yes.
These are much louder, aren't they? I just realized that. Okay. This is should be a fairly straightforward item. It's a text amendment for enforcement of the weeds chapter. It will affect 2 chapters of the city ordinance, chapter 9 and chapter 21A. That's why we have planning staff and then Orion here from building services. He can speak to the changes in chapter 9 if there's additional questions about that. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to Kelsey to give the background.
Hi, I'm Kelsey Lindquist with Planning. This is a request to amend Chapter 21A20 to coincide with amendments that have occurred to the state code pertaining to enforcement, civil fee collection, and noticing. The updates include clear language on the noticing of the city's intent to abate zoning violations, collection of the costs of abatement, the appeals process, and the duties of the roles of the fines hearing officer. And just as a clarification, this service is not governed by the Utah Rules of Civil Procedure, and we are happy to answer any questions about 21A20.
Council members, do you have any questions on this one? Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. My only question was just, is there been a problem when, like, what's prompting this change? Has there been a problem in the past with enforcement, or is it just to update?
Well, the way I understand it, there was some changes to state law,
Okay,
and this was an effort to coordinate better.
with the notice requirements?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Anybody else? Orion, could you go a little bit deeper in just to, or, I'm sorry, is it Katie?
Kelsey.
Kelsey,
That's okay.
either of you, on to contextualize this particular ordinance. And I know that it's not governed under the same rules, and that we're bringing it into that consistency. But the part about the Civil Enforcement Department being able to issue tax liens.
Yeah, in the past, what we've done is put notices of noncompliance, tools like that on titles, and it doesn't seem to be a real effective enforcement tool. So in concert with the attorney's office, this plan should be a better deterrent, as well as allow us to collect fines easier.
And in other civil enforcement, non-nuisance, but other maybe similar notification opportunities, do we issue tax liens, or we have the ability to issue tax liens on?
That's a really good question. I think that this may be a model of see how it works, and maybe branch it out into other civil enforcement issues that we have. We may want to bring one of the attorneys up to talk a little bit about that if you want to go deeper.
I don't know that I do necessarily. So we've got one on her way up, so we might as well hear. I guess I'm curious. It sounds like a fairly strong tool for weed enforcement.
Yeah, my name is Samantha Stark. I'm one of the attorneys up on the 5th floor in the city attorney's office. The tax lien's not a unique tool. It's actually been part of the state code for, gosh, at least since 2011 and sometime before. And it has been a tool that has been used for enforcement. The state code was updated back in 2011, and a lot of the amendments with regard to what have been done in this ordinance were to bring it in line with amendments that were made in the state code, as opposed to enforcing and creating an entirely new tool.
But the application of civil penalties associated with the ability to issue a tax lien is unique we're hearing from Orion. I recognize that the tool isn't new, but we're using it here in a new way, or in a new suite of enforcement, perhaps.
And just to make sure I understand the question, when you say civil penalties, are you as a
I'm sorry, I mean civil enforcement.
it's my understanding that the department has been using it as a tool for a number of years. So it wouldn't be a new enforcement. Mhm.
Orion, okay, we just need you in the mic.
I don't know the answer to that exactly. But we're looking for any tool that's going to be quicker and more effective.
Can do follow-up.
Okay. Yeah, please, Cindy.
Just, can you give us an example? Right now, the council members might be contacted by a person who has received a notice that they will be getting a fine, and that adds up, and then it goes to court and that type of thing. Can you tell us how this will be different than that?
So yeah, they're handled differently. So as you sort of say, a fine gets paid and is judgment against the person. Tax liens are used specifically to compensate for cleanup costs. So for example, if you have a property that gets into a really bad state of disrepair, the city goes to court, gets a judgment that allows them to go onto the property and perform the cleanup. The purpose of the tax lien is to recover the costs for cleaning the property, not for paying the fine that has accrued over X number of years while the property's been in disrepair.
I asked then, so if there is a pile-up of fine, then that would remain independent of the tax lien dollar amount, which would be strictly to make the city whole again for whatever contract services cleaned up the property.
That's correct.
Okay. Anybody else? Well, thank you. It looks like we don't have a public hearing date set yet. And a tentative action tonight?
We'll be setting the public hearing date for February 6th later tonight.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's right, because I'm looking at the wrong agenda item, so bear with me. We're on to number 3, which is an informational discussion on inclusionary zoning research. And we will have Nick stay with us, Melissa Jensen, the director of HAND, and Sean Murphy with HAND, and anyone else who's planning to join us. Hi. Hello.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Welcome, new council members, and congratulations again to our returning council members. We're happy to have you and get started in this year. And we've certainly picked a great topic to start with, inclusionary zoning. It is, I'll start by saying it can be a very divisive topic for communities, from advocates and developers, private sector, public sector, et cetera. And so as we prepared this transmittal, we really wanted to lay it out in a way where we were exploring many of our options and have a open conversation so that as we go forward, we can both engage with you, the council, as well as our community as we continue to dissect which, if any, policies would be suitable for Salt Lake City. So with that in mind, I think that we have just a couple of goals today that you could help us with. And as we go through the presentation, I think one thing to consider is to help us get a better understanding of any areas and policies of interest that the council has as you go through some of the different examples, and then any issues or concerns, as well as any questions that we may need to answer going forward. What we know about inclusionary zoning around the country is that it takes quite a bit of resources, staff resources, community engagement resources, et cetera. So I think as we go forward, we want to be really cognizant about the direction so that we can make sure that we appropriately resource it within our division. So of course, this is going to be one of many conversations, but we wanted to frame it in this way so that we could make sure that we all go forward together on the right path. With that in mind, I will turn it over to Sean to kind of lead us through some of the information that we have prepared for you, the council, unless there's any other initial thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. One of the things to think about with inclusionary zoning is that this is one of those policies that many municipalities take on, and it looks a little bit different in virtually every one of them. There are hundreds of programs around the country. Over the last 3 decades, the inclusionary zoning programs have produced probably 175,000 units around the country, and very few programs look exactly the same. In a grand scheme, it is a way of saying, a municipality saying, for each unit or certain number of units of development a developer builds, they're going to contribute to the affordable housing stock, typically 1 on-site unit, 1 off-site unit, which might be around the corner. It's typically important to have it sort of in the same neighborhood, or a contribution to your housing trust fund, or a land donation. And that varies a lot based on what the development community has, what the economics of your city are. That's really important. It's probably one of the biggest drivers. And then also the politics of the state and of the city are huge drivers of what can work with any type of inclusionary programming. One of the things that don't end up, one of the things that really drives it is this payment in lieu of development under options. It's something that a number of council members have brought up that want to be included in any type of incentives and options or requirements that we're placing on new development. And some municipalities don't do that. I think that the reason they don't is because not all municipalities have high functioning housing trust funds or something like it. I think our housing trust fund operates very efficiently and very well and has a great reputation, so that I think any of these options here is something that we would really consider. Again, there are programs around the country though, and they all vary in scale, in shape, and in size a little bit. Most of the states in the country now have some type of inclusionary program operating, either mandatory or voluntary. The best practices, if you look at programs that have been successful over time, because now they date back to the early 70s, so we do have a litany of different programs to assess and see what works and what doesn't. They're uniform and they're targeted. One of the things that a lot of cities have gotten caught up in is having varying requirements and varying expectations on development in different parts of the city. And the more convoluted it is, then the more difficult it is for developers to understand it, and the harder it is to track over time. So policies that get to very specific target areas is one way to do it. You can either do it across an entire city, or you can say, we're going to have it in this special geographic area. That has been done by census tracts in some cities, by zoning districts in some cities, and by project type, multifamily, for instance, or missing middle housing. Those zoning types might be targeted. Mandatory versus voluntary. Voluntary programs need very, very strong incentives in order to work. There are some voluntary programs around the country and even in Utah that haven't produced any units at all. And so mandatory programs that have a bevy of options to developers as to how to comply with that regulation are typically those that actually function. And then one of the other things to think about is that a lot of criticisms for the last decade about inclusionary zoning is that it hasn't solved housing, and it won't, but it is one option that will help get us there. It's not a cure-all though.
I think as we contemplated growing SLC, we felt it was a really, really critical piece to look at. And because there is so much information about how it's been rolled out in other cities, I think it can be very informative as we look at it. And we also know it's really important to much of our advocacy community as they go forward. And in the transmittal attached was a consultant reports to that end. And so we wish we could come here and say this is the city that's done it the best and produced the most units, but we know that every city, it has been an uphill struggle to get this on the ground in a way that is really, really smooth and efficient. So I think too, on the other side of the page, you kind of see what it takes to not only have a really sound policy, but implementation. If you can get to a place where you feel really good about a policy, you still have the implementation components of compliance, tracking, building services, planning. I mean, all of those pieces have to be part of the puzzle for it to work internally and to really have the effect that you want. It can be seen as, to Sean's point, either really, it can be viewed at times as a punitive measure or a sort of incentive. And we've also seen combinations where it is required and incentivized, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on.
Some of the lessons learned in the criticisms.
Sean, can I
yeah,
interrupt you
please.
before you go on? Back on the previous page, under flexibility, when it talks about programs with the highest success rates, is success only defined by the creation of units where it was possible that they wouldn't have been there otherwise? Or is it also by lack of litigation or state challenges? How broad is success defined?
I would consider those items in the last category as well.
Okay, thank you.
Lack of successful court challenges and broad acceptance by a development community and increased growth over time.
It was recently challenged in Los Angeles, where the community brought it forward and said it was, that they couldn't do inclusionary zoning, and they sided with the inclusionary zoning policy. And that's just the most recent case, and I think Nick could probably tell us a little bit more if needed on that one, but to Sean's point.
Thank you.
A spotty application, once programs are rolled out, some of the things that end up being failures in those programs are something like spotty application. So in the transmittal, we discuss and do a very, very rudimentary model of what an inclusionary zoning program might have produced in number of affordable units in the TSA since the creation of the TSA zone. And Nick Norris and planning are quick to point out that our zoning density and allowable uses adjoining the TSA are very comparable to the TSA. So if we had a zoning program that was in one target area, but developers could simply sidestep that a block away and build something very similar, then the application has holes in it. And so making sure that we have a uniform and consistent layout, particularly if the city was interested in a targeted approach or an IZ program that had specific boundaries around it. That's something really important to think about. The uncoordinated upzoning is something that a number of cities have had difficulty with, and it's something that we need to consider here as well, that many of the zones where we would expect or target inclusionary zoning, either downtown, the TSA, for instance, there might not be development desire to build any higher than what is being built right now. And frequently, one of the best options and best incentives you can provide to a developer is to give them a density bonus. Say if you're going to build another floor, if we allowed you to build another floor on this building, we would want half of the units of one floor to be designated affordable. You can only do that if the market is already building to the threshold of what your density is in that zone. And so that gets into a lot of nuance and detail about specific application and specific zoning, but it's something that would need to be considered very, very closely. And then additionally, monitoring, like Melissa mentioned, that municipalities that have successful programs have an entire team that work on inclusionary zoning. Here it would be a little bit different. We're not the size of Montgomery County. We don't have 1 million residents, but that's something that we also don't do right now. We have compliance in place through finance, and whenever we're giving money out through the Housing Trust Fund, or if a developer's getting state funds, there is a auditing process to make sure that they're compliant. That's something that we haven't built in to any other program here, and so it would need to be created anew.
I think we hear a lot of, we've listed just a few of the common criticisms that we hear from our community in terms of their concerns around IZ policies, inclusionary zoning. And that is namely the increasing of, it's going to inflate already skyrocketing rental prices. It will hinder development, or it will move just outside of the boundary. Even if it was citywide, Salt Lake City, then perhaps people would go just to South Salt Lake or some of the other adjacent cities. I think a criticism that we would see is that it doesn't meet our highest need population, which is the 40% AMI and below. It is generally targeted towards that 60 and 80% AMI. As this council is aware, and of course HAND is as well, we need housing for all types, but we know our greatest need is that very low income. We find around the country, if you're 40% AMI and below, you probably need some additional resources, as we've spoken about. And so you're also thinking about how to place populations that really need high need, and sometimes placing them in a development with a management company that's not enticed to serve that population. It's not going to produce good outcomes. However, if you're dealing with 60% or 80% AMI, it's a much more feasible that they would integrate with little or absolutely no case management services. And so we certainly hear that. And then there's also a thought that the burden begins to rest solely on the development community, and housing is a citywide issue, and certainly not just the responsibility of developers. So we wanted to share just obviously some of the things we hear from both sides to give you a sense of the variety of things that come out from communities as we've seen it be implemented around the country. I think some further policy considerations, and we'll have plenty of time for questions here. We just want to go through these last few pages. I think it offers a lot as well, and we can understand why in a time when we are facing limited resources, federal funding is continuing to decrease. It is a policy direction that can be taken with no resources. However, we know that that is not the best practice. It usually is aligned with some incentive. But it certainly provides some system-wide equity in terms of where housing is built, which has been certainly we've heard that from this council in terms of making sure that it is distributed evenly. Another thing that we think about is new construction. Sorry, you want to speak to that one?
This is one of those policies that helps us get new units to the market, and it then alleviates strain on either very low income dollars or rehabilitation or acquisition dollars, and so it can help bring new units to the market that are going to be online for 50 years or the term of the building, and allow the city to be more focused with its other monies on that acquisition, the rehabilitation. And sort of similarly on that along with it being new construction, it's also built right alongside the rest of wherever new construction is going in the city. So there's a neighborhood continuity. That's something that council members have expressed over time, is concern over, one, concentrating affordable units in their own standalone developments, but then also, what does an affordable housing development look like? And frankly, I think that the modern examples that we have of income-restricted units around the city are great, but this is even more in line with that, because they're going to be with the same facades and everything else that are going on the market at $500,000.
So you can see a lot of this, and then of course, again, talking about the income, there are a lot of benefits as well, which is why we see it widely used around the country. I don't want to underestimate that fact that as you look at the map on the first couple of pages, it is a widely used policy. So cities have looked at this and thought, this is the way we want to do it. We just want to be really clear about some of the challenges that we might see, and that also realizing that each city has found its own size, right? Not every city is doing this the same. And that really speaks to ability and impact. I think as we think about our circumstances in Utah, in our political environment, we want to make sure that we're considering that as policy guidance as we go forward. Will the state allow something like this to happen if it is mandatory, et cetera? And then in creating a policy and taking it forward, would it have the impact that we desire? And I think that's a really important question to ask up front, because these are complicated policies. If we spend a significant amount of time and resources towards building a policy, but then the unit production is quite low, we obviously want to know that beforehand, and HAND will be a facilitator in making sure we understand that, but obviously bringing it to your attention as policymakers as well, that that's something we're very cognizant of.
A couple of examples that there are many examples. I'm happy to supply council staff with all the research that HAND has been looking at in considering this. But Montgomery County's had one of the longest running programs. It's also, interestingly, a program that has changed over time. There have been additions and modifications as it goes on from 1974 until today, but there's never been a whole-scale, we're cutting this program and we're gonna give it a hiatus and we're gonna come back to the drawing board. They have had a program in place that has been producing units every single year since 1974. Even in downturns around, that US had economic downturns, but the DC market was still strong and there was still housing production. But one of the biggest years that they had was 1984, where there was no development going on anywhere else in the country. But to date, yes.
I think Councilmember Kinchin wants to jump in.
I'm
for a
just
second.
curious how that number compares to the overall units, housing units developed in that county.
You know, and that's something that is a little bit harder to find, but I can dig that up.
Is it harder to find that number?
I mean, well, they also, so the this program in Montgomery County has got a full staff on it, and they pull together the details of the program very neatly for you. So it would just, I can dig for it a little bit though. So 15,300 units produced up until 2016. That doesn't include this year.
And Sean, do they have an in lieu of option in Montgomery County?
They do.
Okay.
What is there, Madam Chair, what is there in lieu?
I can look
How
that
many,
up.
what's the population in Montgomery County?
It's 1 million.
It's what?
It's 1 million. It's 1 point.
We're comparing 190,000 population to.
Well,
1
it's.
million.
I wouldn't call it a comparison.
Well, we're getting ideas from it, right? And we're going to try. We're talking about implementing something that's coming from a population that's basically 5 times what Salt Lake is.
Ideas certainly.
Right.
I wouldn't call it a comparison, but it's an example from
Okay.
from around the country.
Potato, right? I have a couple other questions. Do we have any data of cities losing growth due to the inclusionary zoning ordinance, or developers going outside of that?
So there has been.
Data. I'm not saying the actual raw
Right.
data.
Right. The last time I looked for those studies, the slowdown or elimination of development was inconclusive. There was, the closest thing that I could find to try to track that down was whether or not overall new housing units were being impacted in terms of cost. Because one of the other common criticisms is that it's going to push out, or excuse me, not push out, it's going to increase the rents or the rates
Right, market rate.
on everything else. And that tended to be about 1 to 3% of an increase. But the specifically pushing out or slowing down, being able to get down to the point of saying that, yes, it was inclusionary zoning that ended development for this municipality. I haven't been able to find anything that can reputably report that.
Couple others, if you're okay with that.
Sure.
Okay. So your data here that you showed in 2000 to 2009, there were 45% of all, not all, but we had 45% of IZ zones implemented, right? 2010 to today, it's 8%. Why is that? Why is it for the first 9 years there's 45%, statistic, and then after that it's only 8 of implementation?
Can you tell me what? you're
Yeah, let me
referring-
look
It's
it
in
up.
the, it's in the full transmittal, right?
In the full transmittal, and it is under, of course, I've got to find it now.
Nope, that's okay. Sean may know off the top of his head, but I would need to look at.
Let's see.
Yeah. In this transmittal.
Oh, I think, so the
Programs
point
were
there,
developed since the 2000s.
Right.
45% of all programs around the U.S. were adopted between
right,
2000 and
Which-
2009.
Page
Which is
5 of
basically to-
86
to
for everybody
point
else.
out that it's been going on for a long time. At the same time,
Right.
the last 2 decades is where it's really developed steam.
I mean, I understand that, Sean, and I don't want you to feel like you have to defend your work. You've done a great job. This is great stuff.
Oh, I'm happy to defend if
Great.
that's
Well,
what we're doing.
let's go to it then. Let's go to your map here. I mean, you look at it, you look at Salt Lake City. Now, when we went to Denver and Boulder, when we were talking to some of the city people there, they talked about that Denver's talking about getting rid of their IZ zone. Is that correct?
They are actively revising,
Okay.
and I haven't heard anyone say we are cutting it and eliminating it and walking away from it. And I think there's a big difference.
But I think it is fair to say, Councilmember Rogers, that there are many cities that have not felt that it was as successful as they had intended it to be. And I think that that is the issue that we're seeing, and we really, as a administration, want to be sensitive to, because I think for a long time, especially in the early growth of the program, anecdotally, we really heard that they thought this was going to be the solution to the affordable housing issues. And as you know, other cities of our size are struggling with the same homelessness issues and housing issues that we are today, and they have gone down this path for many years. And so I think it's with that realization that as we look at this, we have to be really honest about that, and knowing that it may or may not be an ideal framework for this city. And again, that this is one possible thing to explore as we consider the rest of growing SLC.
Right. And so, Sean, my point is, you look at the map basically, and you take Park City out of it. You know, it's basically on the coast, right? That you've got these inclusionary zonings. And I mean, you have some, it looks like in Texas, but they're fewer, 1 to 3.
Sure.
I mean, you look in the middle of the United States, you're looking at 1 to 3. And for me, it's not that I'm not in favor of it. I just want to make sure that this is a unique opportunity for Salt Lake City, but it's also a unique opportunity for the state, because Salt Lake City, as you're well aware, we're encompassed by other municipalities that are not going to do this. And if we do this, it could affect potentially the growth of Salt Lake City. And that's my main concern, is because we want to make sure that we're growing and not forcing developers to grow. When we see South Salt Lake and they're already developing, you see the growth that they're seeing, I just don't want to see that stop. And I'm afraid that what I've heard from other developers and contacting them outside the state is inclusionary zoning does impede the growth that once you've created that momentum.
So Sean has a few more cities or examples. Do you want to quickly get through those? 'Cause
Absolutely.
I think we're ready to dig in.
Thank you. And a point very well taken, not taken lightly. One of the other things that, Councilmember Rogers, I asked you to consider is that when the council has questions or is coming up with ideas for what they might want to see, it's hard to put together a realistic or meaningful model for what this could or may do, whether it produces or pushes out or impacts market rate development, without some very specific metrics and parameters around that kind of a study. There are just so many different options that the city could employ in implementing this, that if you don't have some type of consensus on what it is that you're even thinking about, then modeling it just is kind of futile. To that point about sort of the start and stop nature of some of these programs, the second example from Seattle, they're on their 3rd program. In 2017, they started a new program that focused mandatory inclusionary zoning in the downtown core. They liked the way that went, and they now expanded that to much of the rest of the city, but they're also including virtually a citywide upzone that comes with it. They've got, this is after 2 programs had a lot of pushback and they ultimately cut and walked away from. They're also expecting over the next 10 years that through their inclusionary zoning program, they're gonna produce about 10,000 units. 6,000 of those are going to come in mandatory areas, and then another 4,000 just through incentives.
So I think just skipping to the last page so we can dive into any questions the council has. You see here the local examples, and of course there's Park City, Midway. We know anecdotally that when Park City went through their beginning discussions that they got strong pushback from the state and the state legislature in terms of what their program was going to look like and how it took shape. We included our own division on here just as a very bottom and sort of as a heads up as we've looked at growing SLC and how we could dispose of our own surplus land, and if that's a way that we could provide a process in which it's considered for affordable housing. I think we do that very much in practice today as we look at land, but certainly it could be formalized. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions or write them down so that we can answer them in the future.
Councilmember Kitchen.
First, I'd like to thank you both for this work. I know you've put a lot of effort into these policies that we're going to be have considered and will be considering over the next year and some, so thank you. I would like to speak to the concern that James brought up, because when we talk about housing in Salt Lake City, at the end of the day, our big issue is that we just don't have enough stock. We don't have enough housing units, period, whether they're affordable or market rate. And so I want to be mindful of the potential to stunt growth. And I don't know if that will be the case, but I just want to, that's a fear that I think is shared among some of us here. And so any information that you can provide us that will either make us feel better or cement our concerns would probably be helpful for this body. I would like to say as well, in addition to that, that last year, mid-summer sometime, I was thumbing through a report from the Brookings Institute, and they have a metro policy program of some sort that does a ton of research on municipalities and urban centers. And one of the key takeaways that I've had from that was that metros that have inclusionary policies and policies broadly speaking that promote inclusion, whether it's housing policy or something else, they tend to have higher rates of upward mobility, which leads to more economic development, obviously wage growth, and just overall prosperity for the municipality. And so I would be interested to know if you have any, do you have an economist working on this by chance? And has Laura or anybody on her team had an opportunity to weigh in on this? If not, it may be worthwhile just to have a conversation with somebody who's doing housing economics and, you know, get some feedback there. Because I think in this state in particular, the economic argument tends to hold more water than the social justice argument. And so that may help us when we're having conversations with our colleagues at the state legislature. So that being said, what kind of outreach or feedback have you received from the development community so far? And what do you intend to do going forward? Because I think the big concern that I'm hearing is primarily from in-state developers about the point that James brought up. And on the other hand, the broader community is expressing support for an inclusionary policy to me, including out-of-state developers. And so it is kind of a mixed bag going into this conversation. So just any input that you can provide as far as what the development community has to say would be great.
Thank you. That's a great question, Councilmember Kitchen. We've done 2 things initially, and the first is we just launched a survey to be open-ended for as long as we're continuing to have this conversation. It's very high level, and it certainly would not be the extent of our public engagement, but just to get a sense of where our community is at in general. And that survey does not have a ton of responses. It'll continue to be open, but we'll use it as a guide. And there you're seeing a mixed bag. We've only had about 100 respondents, which is not substantial. From our development community, what's interesting is that in a lot of communities around, and especially on the coasts, all of their affordable housing developers are nonprofits. But in our community, the majority of our affordable housing developers are private developers. And so we do hear from our community that is building affordable housing that they are not particularly in favor of it. We've heard that, and this is me speaking anecdotally, so this is not, peer-reviewed research. But what I hear in my conversations is they don't think that they wouldn't move right outside the city or the zone, that wouldn't be the driver. However, they believe that it would increase the market rent prices. And so that is one of the loudest arguments that I hear in terms of their fear, is that it's going to continue to inflate an already unaffordable city for most of our population. I would say that our developer community that is private primarily does not support an IZ policy for a variety of reasons, many of which we've mentioned today.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that, Mr. Chair? Is that under the understanding of a non-incentivized IZ program that they're talking about, or is there a common language being spoken now when we have discussions on this?
In preliminary conversations, it is very clear that under no circumstances would it be successful without an incentive. So there is a lot of pushback towards that notion in general. So if you just were to do a mandatory policy with absolutely no incentive, then for sure you would see marketplaces inflate, and it would sort of begin to have developers looking elsewhere. HAND, Housing and Neighborhood Development, recognizes that the best practice really is to pair the two together. And so even with that, you don't get as strong as opposition, but they don't believe it is the best solution.
So even with that understanding between two, they're both saying, even with incentives, this is still, we believe, going to harm the market in their view.
Yes.
Okay.
And they're one stakeholder, I would also like to remind the council.
Sure.
I wanted to follow up on that with whether or not you've had, it doesn't sound like yet, you've had conversations with employers who are looking for housing for their employees in that 60 to 80% range that the IZ seems to fill. It's not, I don't think it's just about the development community. We're really trying to recruit or get more centralized opportunities for work and residency for businesses here. So I wonder, I guess perhaps for a follow-up for a future discussion, I'd like to hear if these other cities who've gone through public process and outreach, stakeholder building, how they've interacted with major employers in the city. Or also, I think it feeds into Derek's point about bringing economic development in to give that perspective to it, but also to open the door perhaps for conversations with employers that I think that department in the city definitely has a closer finger on the pulse of their housing needs from the employment sector.
I think that there is going to be a need probably, and it will be helpful, and this is helpful for me to hear from you all in terms of HAND could certainly do a more formalized outreach approach in terms of thoughts around IZ, et cetera, if there is, especially as it relates to a specific type. So if the council feels like there is one area that they're more interested in getting feedback on or another, because I think all of those things are really critical to provide a picture of what our community thinks. We know that those who are invested in housing are going to be the first to come out, but those like employers may not realize what impact an IZ policy may have for them in a positive way.
I would just add to that there are programs around the country that focus on specific employment type. There are, for instance, firefighters, first responders, and teachers. Those are just some of the examples that I've seen.
I think that was a question late last year in terms of can we do that type of housing, and it is done around the country.
Anybody else? Back to you, Andrew.
One of the things I heard you say is that it's hard to put numbers to this without specific concepts or a model. to try it out, to test it out. Is that accurate? Because one of my questions is, when you pair, although the voluntary ones, as far as the data shows, aren't very successful as far as numbers go, right? We know that a lot of developers here, at least we've heard, that they're not interested in going over 6 stories because it's not worth their time, right, or cost. So density bonuses probably don't work in a lot of the city. If you were to say there's a financial kick-in or a buyout of the requirement, what is the offset we'd have to add to that, right? Does it still make it feasible for them? Does it make them more lucrative for them to help do this? I think it'd be helpful for me if we could get some idea of a model or models. I think there's some recommendations in here about different funding sources and types. Put some numbers to it and get a better sense of exactly what we're looking at. So if I'm a developer and I'm told inclusionary zoning, and I have various models in my head perhaps, or none, just the idea of it, it's much different to say, all right, here's a couple models we're looking at, ideas. This is what it looks like penciling out.
For in lieu fees.
Yeah, I mean, fees.
That's sort of the framework in which you're saying, if we knew exactly what it was going to cost or what the in lieu fee would be to the development community.
A different idea, to have a more tangible and focused discussion on this, because in the idea of it, I think we get caught up in the concept of, well, are they going to move because it's less incentivized? Is it more expensive? Is it fair? All these kind of questions come in without having some nuts and bolts specific decisions. I think this is, in my view, part of a larger housing discussion, because if you look at places near us that are having very dense development, where's it going? It's going along tracks lines, right? Fixed rail. It's not about the city's incentive, it's about access to transit. And that should be part of our discussion as well. This doesn't solve our 40% below, right? However, it does hit a section we haven't talked about. It also means if you have incentives that are in lieu of, you can take some of that money and use it to anything else you might need, which could help other areas, right? That's why I think this is a great discussion worth having, especially in the sense of a very small geographic city that is fairly, I don't say built out. There's not a ton of just land sitting vacant, right? We don't have a lot of place to annex. There's some unique sort of pieces to this. And so it'd be nice to see a couple models, some numbers put to it, get a sense of how this would actually look for a developer as we had to have discussions going forward.
Councilmember Luke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So a couple of things that I'm interested in seeing back. While I do have some concerns about the fact that we are, surrounded by wall-to-wall cities, and that, the creep for developers to just decide to move directly outside the boundaries, as you mentioned earlier in your comments, is a real one. I mean, we deal with that all the time with economic development in particular. We do have a history of developers land banking in the city. Just look at Main Street, look at the Zephyr, look at some of these other key buildings that we have that are and have been land banked for decades. So while I'm somewhat concerned about just the idea and the concept of inclusionary zoning in and of itself, I'm very supportive, though, of looking at incentives and having an incentive-based zoning and looking at different tools that we can look at. To Andrew's point, I think a lot of the key housing developments that we're seeing right now are on light rail because that's where it makes a lot of sense. Plus, those developers are using the transit-oriented development zoning incentives that are there. And so I do think that incentives do make sense. I don't think, though, that we just need to be looking at financial incentives, especially in the downtown area. When we're looking at density makes sense to me where we already have existing infrastructure to support it. We have that downtown. We have that in our transit zones. What I would be interested in seeing some ideas of, and if there are other cities that have done this, looking at different policy and zoning incentives. For example, removing height limitations, would be one of them. Looking at increased density and doing things that the current zoning doesn't allow, but it would be an incentive for a developer to come in and say, yeah, look, we can go up an additional, few stories if we provide this type of housing. Those are some of the things that I'm interested in seeing. I think if we simply start coming in and saying every single housing development in the city has to have X number of affordable units, will drive developers outside. I think out-of-state developers currently can do exactly what they're talking about if they're willing to do it. So while you're continuing to do your research, looking at some of those other incentives, whether it's height restrictions, other densification sorts of issues or things that I would be very interested in looking at.
Great. Thank you, Councilmember Luke. We're going to go to Councilmember Wharton and then Fowler.
Thank you. I was just wondering if you're aware of any cities, or if you looked at, if there are any examples out there of cities that are similar to Salt Lake in terms of size or in terms of being walled in, that have considered adopting this and declined to do so.
In terms, I haven't found one that is a really even pair.
Okay.
And that's partially because of our relatively small geographic footprint and seemingly porous boundaries. That's one of the key drivers there. I think it's something that we'll continue to look for as we sort of comb through options.
Okay. And you'd mentioned before that we need to talk about like really creative funding opportunities that are unique to Utah. Are those all detailed in the advisory committee report, or are there additional?
In terms of the long-term funding source?
Yes.
Yeah, so just some quick background on that, Councilmember Wharton. The Finance Committee met in the spring 2 years ago and kind of laid out what they really thought were viable solutions. And so that is where I would spend initial, and that is what is reflected in Growing SLC in terms of what our development, finance, and advocacy community thought were viable sources that would actually produce units.
Thanks, Councilmember Fowler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Couple of questions. One is piggybacking off of something that Councilmember Luke said. As you're looking at sort of these other incentives outside of simply financial incentives, fast tracking permits or fast tracking building, is that feasible and possible for us to look at as an incentive? Is that something we have already looked at? Is that going along with what Councilmember Luke said? Well,
I think it's both, and you will see that. The council will see some proposals related to an expedition process and sort of what that would cost, because certainly there's a cost, and whether or not as a policy you think it's feasible, and then again, will it produce the impact that we hope for? So certainly you will see that in the near future, Councilmember Fowler.
And then my other question, just curious, I guess more than anything, is in the example out of Seattle where they are doing both the mandatory and the incentives, how do they choose what area or building or developer gets the mandatory versus the incentive? Is it region? Having lived in Seattle, I imagine most of it is regional, but.
Right, and so all of the downtown core is now mandatory, and it's got the highest density bonus. And then sort of emanating out from there is where it tapers off. And I don't even know if West Seattle has really any, except for a long new transportation corridor. Okay. But when you get into the really exclusively single-family home character or duplex neighborhoods, then that's where they've got the incentive-based requirements.
And that is a projection, right? This is a new program that they're launching, so it'll be interesting to see how it tracks in their third rendition of this going forward.
And is Seattle, sorry, Madam Chair, but are they one of the areas that does nonprofit builders, that uses nonprofit builders or developers to do this, or do they have for-profit developers as well? I just feel like, I know this is new, and so I doubt there's a lot of data right now, but I think it would be interesting to look at what their feedback was from different developers and different community members as we are looking at these two different models and kind of seeing what they saw, I guess, right? And kind of hoping to get a little bit of foresight, I guess. Yeah, I think that was my only thing.
Thank you.
You want to jump back in?
One more question, Madam Chair, about staffing numbers. We had a discussion during the ADU period back about what does planning need to have an ADU ordinance effectively done and enforced, right? You said that most cities who have these have multiple staff, plural. Do you have a sense of how many are in these cities and what their demands are on staff time? Is that part of what you've looked at already, or?
We've not delved into that. I think as we kind of go forward, as we look at specific scenarios, we'll try to pair that with resources to give the council an idea of what it would take.
Thank you. That'd be very helpful as well. I think we sometimes miss that up front. How do we enforce this? How do we make it useful? Whether it's incentives, fast track, building those kind of things, or just dealing with the entire program across the city. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I have a couple questions too, but I'm going to
Just
do
to
some.
follow up, Madam Chair.
Oh, please.
Yeah, I'd love to meet with you offline, Melissa, to talk more about this.
Great.
Thank
I'll set
you.
something up.
I'm going to do something a little different and just see if I can re-summarize what points I think you all asked for follow-up on. Derek asked about economic perspective and having that department look at this dialogue early on and maybe issue an economic sort of take on the opportunity here. Andrew and Derek both wanted to know about future outreach, and I want to know about at what point we bring in employers to that. Andrew talked about creating more tangible models for feedback. When we throw the wide net, we can get a wide array of responses that can ultimately influence where we go, but that might be quite different if we were more articulate in the beginning. Charlie talked about enumerating those incentives early on also, and Amy, for all of us to consider. And Amy talked about what feedback, looking at other cities, maybe you could bring us some examples from the broader national conversation when we get to the part about looking at different models, whether it's voluntary or involuntary and in lieu of or not, so we can consider that broader developer context. Because certainly we want to entice developers who aren't here yet too. I think those opinions from around the country are legitimate. And from the higher level dialogue, we absolutely are, we're making a patchwork quilt of affordable housing solutions. And I appreciate that you mentioned many times in the report that this isn't the solution to housing, and other cities have regretfully discovered that. But we knew that that's not the case. And with our commitment to not have projects in the city, that means we got to take many bites at this apple. And the ADU is, I think, the most incremental step of affordable housing that really I'm not going to get into right now, but inclusionary zoning is another one of those. Leveraging our city-owned properties is another one. But ultimately, we keep coming back around to money and a more consistent, larger stream of funding coming into affordable housing. And so I ask rhetorically at this point, with all these facets of affordable housing conversation that we keep having and we're going to continue having, when do we have the conversation about the money? Our 21 million is going to be gone in the blink of an eye. All to good things. But the needs of the community will not be gone. And so I'd like to hear from the administration, and whether that's, collectively from several departments or from the mayor and her staff themselves. We need to begin that conversation. I know Seattle has an incredible housing levy that's been renewed by their voters several times. What are our options? And I don't want to wait too long to have those. Also, I'd like to hear in the future from our planning department. I'm thinking of property to my peers that we just upzoned, basically on 5th South. James Alfondri came talking to us about it. And we look at the potential for 5th South for future upzoning and the kind of development that I think is hungry to go in there, and we're not zoned there yet. So if we could contextualize a bit of we've talked about that broadly speaking too, that there's a lot of areas that we could upzone and we could see greater development in. So when you talk about having strong incentive programs, I think that my sense is that there are some areas of the city that are quite underzoned and ripe for incentives to entice that kind of development. And I am open to a voluntary discussion around inclusionary zoning, because I think we have the leverage of that desire that doesn't currently exist across the counter. Okay, and I appreciate, I think Charlie probably does too, that you mentioned the opportunity perhaps for police and fire, for teachers to access this type of housing. We have brought that up in the past, and I'd like that to continue in our exploration around this. Anything else that anybody thought up before we let these fine people sit down?
Madam Chair, I would just like to express my general support for trying this out in a targeted area and seeing how it expresses itself in Salt Lake. I don't know if we also pair that with, if we do the carrot and the stick in that way, or how that would work out necessarily, but you know, it was mentioned that maybe we look at a really flexible zone that's really exciting to developers, like form-based, for instance, and maybe pairing inclusionary to that, and where we might do that in the city, whether it's State Street or 4th South. I guess TSA is a little different, but similar. And so I just want to toss that out there to this body.
So maybe that in the model development that I hope you'll be bringing some examples to us of more concrete possible models for us, that you could come back with one that's more rapidly implementable, if that's a word, in the TSA zone or some pilot area. Is that what you're asking for?
Yeah, I'm just putting on my hat as a prospective developer, and if we see a tightening of regulation, and this could be considered tightening in some way or more restrictive, how do we counter that with a loosening, right? And keep the balance there.
Right. I agree. I am concerned about the state's potential reaction to this. And you talk about the balance in other cities of housing market demand and politics. And in my opinion, we have an incredible market. We saw 4 times the multifamily development in terms of how many units were produced in Salt Lake City when compared to the second highest producing municipality in the state. We know developers want to build here. We won't get into all the many reasons why. But politically, I don't think that we have the state climate that's interested in us going ahead with a mandatory program. So I am with Derek that I'd really like to hear how we could pair inclusionary zoning voluntary opportunities to areas where there's a desire for upzoning to happen anyway. Yes, please, Mr. Johnston.
Madam Chair, I agree about the concern. I also want to acknowledge there's a general consensus, there's a housing crisis across the entire state. And while we continue to see voluntary incentives be the answers being brought forth by the city, the county, by the state, we also see fairly clearly that even Montgomery County, what was the average per decade of units created? Derek? I'm sorry. How many units per decade for Montgomery County?
Well, it was almost 4 decades, and it was 15,000 units, so 3,500.
When we look at the data, if we're serious about policy, if we look at the numbers say it's not going to do it alone. And if we're going to very target it, we need to be very clear the targeting is going to be it's going to minimize it even more. And we have to be very clear about our entire plan. Growing SLC is about a lot of things. But that the numbers tell us that voluntary incentives have not produced. And if we're going to follow programs that work, then we probably need to make it work. And if we're not going to make it work, let's look at another program, I think. I sort of going halfway in these things, at least seems like it doesn't produce a whole lot. and we have to make a decision about, find what the numbers tell us, do our due diligence outreach to the right folks, talk about numbers, and deal with politics as they are, but I hesitate to sort of go halfway in and then replicate the same lessons learned elsewhere that we've seen, sort of thing, so.
I appreciate
you
your
for that.
gung-ho-ness, Councilmember Johnston. Okay, thank you. We went way over time on this one.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We'll see you again sometime soon, I hope.
Thank you.
We're going to move
Happy New
on
Year.
to item 4, which is the ordinance for our budget amendment number 3 for fiscal year 2017-18, and it's a fairly limited budget amendment. Jennifer Bruno, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This budget amendment is a single item budget amendment, which is not all that typical, but it's to address a fairly time-sensitive issue relating to lights at the Smiths Ballpark. Obviously, they need those lights to conduct their nighttime games, and they're in need of repair. In order for the lead time to sort of, get the system ordered in time, the administration actually needs to know now whether or not the council is supportive of this expenditure. About half of the expenditure would come from the naming rights we receive for the stadium, and then the other half would actually come from general fund balance. This is a city facility, so even though it's a commercial enterprise, the city is still responsible for the majority of the capital needs in the ballpark. And just today, I don't know if Mary Beth is here. There's an update on the bid. If you recall, the council in December straw polled support of this project, so the administration went and issued an RFP to get an initial response on the prices and received some responses.
So the bid response that they received is a total of about $118,000 more than what the budget amendment came in at. So.
418?
No, it's 718.
Sorry. Right. So 300,000 would come from the naming rights. 300,000 would come from general fund balance, and I'm assuming the 118 would also need to be covered from fund balance, and thinking that naming rights is not an option.
And we just received the information today, so that's why we're updating you today.
Updates are good.
But this kind of update is not one that I like to bring to a table.
Madam Chair, I guess I just have a couple questions. In the staff report, it says the ballpark does not appear to have ongoing revenue streams sufficient to cover maintenance and capital investment. That's a real problem, right?
That is correct.
What does the administration have proposed so that there is a revenue source?
I don't know that we have one at this point in time. I think that, maintenance is an issue for a lot of things and a concern for the administration, right? Maintenance on roads, maintenance on our facilities, maintenance on our buildings. It's a great concern, and I think it's something that we will be looking at very closely within Budget Amendment FY19.
Mm-hmm. This is my fear, council members, is that we have so many properties that the city owns that are dilapidated, right? I mean, you look at whether it's the Fisher Mansion, or you've got that old church on 4th North and 9th West in my district. You've got the old Warm Springs building. We don't have revenue sources to keep these buildings afloat, and this is a huge investment for Salt Lake. So I'm all in favor of funding this, but we've got to get together and figure out how these deferred, no, it's not even deferred, it's past deferred. It is dire straits, basically.
Correct. You're correct. And I think that there's a lot of situations that that's occurring in, and I would welcome the council if they had any suggestions, or council staff on any suggestions on how we help fund all maintenance going forward.
Councilmember Luke?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My concern with this is not the need for lighting. Obviously, that is something we need to do. But, it seems like we continue to have these big expenditures coming in budget openings that could have been planned for if somebody had been taking a look at it earlier. When we talk about having a 24-year-old lighting system, this shouldn't really be a surprise. To James's point, this is a facility that is having difficulty finding revenue to continue cycling through to fund the upkeep, while at the same time, one of the two users of the ballpark, the University of Utah, has been talking for 2 years about building its own baseball stadium. closer to campus. It just seems like, you know, we're now having the potential of losing, you know, that user of the facility. So we would just have one user. It's concerning that the administration doesn't seem to have addressed this earlier. I don't have a problem funding it because, again, I think it's important. I think it is a great asset to the city. But it seems that there could have been better ways to fund it that could have been dealt with much earlier in our traditional budget process, and that we could and should have come up with a plan to try to keep the two users of the facility at the facility. That is really going to be the best way that we would be able to recoup some revenue instead of just letting one of them go and then putting this forward in a budget amendment.
Madam Chair, just received a note. Ben Ledke on our staff reminded me that the capital facilities plan is expected later this year to cover sort of all the city facilities and needs, and the council could maybe ask the administration to just make sure that all the Smiths ballpark needs are sort of folded into that, assuming that naming rights isn't changing anytime soon. I don't know.
Councilmember Johnston, did you want to jump in?
Just an update, where does this take us to for fund balance after this opening? If it's funded at a full amount of, what, 718?
So this was the 300,000 was included in the 10.77 percentage. So it'll drop us the additional 118 will drop us very insignificant.
Yeah.
But that's projecting that, you know, we do animal control this year. That's projecting that we do the DA's office this year, and that's also projecting that we have the additional governmental immunity going forward, right?
So
because I wanted to give you everything as much as I had for heads up.
It's 10.77, assuming that those budget amendments are approved in the future, because they're things that you're likely going to need to address.
But not including anything else outside of those already known pieces, right, for the next 6 months?
That is correct.
So 10.7.
Yep.
And change.
Yep.
Okay.
Lisa Schaefer, Public Services, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. And excuse my cold. I'm a little bit more hoarse than normal, which is maybe most of you can't tell. But and congratulations to the new council members. This is my first time addressing you at this table, so congratulations and welcome to the party. I wanted to say in response to Councilmember Luke's comments that I'm extremely sensitive to exactly what you're talking about. The contracts that we have with the Bees organization will be up for renegotiation in 2019, and those are issues that we will definitely consider. Under the current contractual obligation, any revenue that's generated from an outside user, not the Bees, goes directly to the Bees. And so even if we kept the Utes there, we wouldn't see any of that revenue, which is difficult for me to reconcile when we have such issues, you know, as we have capital issues with all of these aging facilities. And so I would like to say that it is something we will be looking at, and hopefully we will negotiate a deal that makes more sense for the ongoing capital needs of that facility going forward.
Councilmember Luke.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Schaefer. I do know that you've been working on this. You and I have talked about this. You and I have talked about, you know, ways to keep the university there. I'm also aware that, you know, the contract is up, and that now's the time really to start looking at that. So I'm pleased to hear that that is something we're going to be looking at. But I do think that, I mean, again, we're going to continue to see problems like this, not just with Smith's Ballpark, but when we have a city and when our infrastructure is as old as it is, when it's been neglected as long as it has been, we're going to continue to see things like this. It was what, 2 years ago when there was the plumbing issue with the pipe burst during the winter at Smith's Ballpark, which created a lot of much more damage than it normally would have because the facility was closed and no one knew about it. I'm happy that we're going to be looking at the contract. I do think that we need to come up with a more comprehensive plan in addition to that contract, though, so that we can plan with the Miller family. I mean, my hope is that that contract's going to be renegotiated because I can't really think of another use for the site if the Bees chose to build or move somewhere else. So That's something that we're going to, you have your work cut out for you. But it is something I think that, for all departments around the city, this is something that we need to be looking at closely, because we will continue to see these last minute expenditures that we're going to be coming up with. And to Andrew's point about fund balance, that it is a very important point, and we're getting very, very close. And when we continue having to fund and deal with infrastructure issues based on emergency problems because we haven't dealt with them the way that we need to, that fund balance is going to be whittled away very, very quickly, and we're going to be in a much, much more difficult situation than we currently are.
Agreed.
So it's good to hear that the contract's coming up, but the reality is that this council isn't going to be negotiating that contract. That's an administrative
That's right.
function. So I think we should look at some policy possibilities around what our appetite is for the city's realistic ongoing maintenance and our own costs that are associated with the capital costs associated with the buildings, particularly buildings that have commercial entities operating out of them. It's not a Warm Springs or a Fisher Mansion that are boarded up and we would love to see become community resources. This is a different kind of a community resource. Is there a facilities fee currently on the ticket?
Facilities fee?
Yes.
There is not. No.
Yeah,
No.
I think we should, that seems like a no-brainer to me, that if we don't have an ongoing revenue stream to take care of the building that we're obliged to take care of, we don't have an option, really, frankly, on this budget amendment. We're contractually obliged to do this. So why don't we create a revenue stream to allow us to do this more safely in terms of our fund balance? So is that an item for our staff to?
I think that it would likely need to be renegotiated with the contract with the Bees if they're the ones essentially collecting the money and issuing the tickets for their commercial events. I can't imagine that we could sort of we'll check with the attorney's office, but I don't know if we could apply a fee mid-contract. That would be a council role for sure.
I didn't mean that if that's an opportunity, let us know. But I meant that we should create a policy prior to the negotiation of the new contract.
And I might have also heard you saying that you'd like some other aspects in that. Maybe we could look at what policy topics, so to speak, are included in the contract for those types of city properties, to see if there might be some policy encouragement that the council could give to the administration in general. You could adopt some policies that could influence other pieces
More
of the
broadly
contract.
than.
Yeah,
Do you mean outside of the ballpark, even to other properties that the city
Possibly.
owns? Yes, that was my intention.
okay, I was thinking, okay.
But also
I didn't say it
within the
very well,
ballpark
but yeah.
contract itself, if there are other opportunities that clearly, Mary Beth and Lisa, you know more about the regular needs of maintaining these kind of facilities, and we would want to account for those, I think, in this discussion. Great. Anybody else?
And maybe the facilities plan could be a sort of first step of assessing what the various needs are at all the different facilities to kind of get that conversation going.
And Jen, thank you, because I do appreciate the opportunity to talk about that and sort of preview that. We're excited to bring that forward to the council. We actually have done a comprehensive assessment of all of our city-owned facilities, and we're in the process of compiling that into a consumable format so that we can kind of show, the effect of a decision. So if you make a decision to invest in this way, what does that do downstream to that specific facility and all of the other facilities that are in the capital facilities plan? And so we're excited to bring that forward. It's not quite ready for prime time, but we're excited to bring that forward, and a lot of work has gone into that. And certainly the ballpark is included. It is one of the city-owned facilities. So
What good timing for us to talk about this. It reminds me of the arts access fee that's on the Eccles tickets that this council put in place before that theater opened, and I know that will be coming up for an item for us to discuss shortly. But there's been a good amount of fund built up in that regard for 50 cents on every ticket,
Right.
and it would make sense that we should we should consider something along those lines to maintain our facility.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we're certainly interested in looking at all of the options available to us. And I would just like to also state that the importance of keeping these facilities up isn't just about maintaining the buildings, but you know, as my good friend Margaret reminded me, we actually settled a lawsuit at the ballpark due to you know, a couple that got hit by a chunk of concrete. And this chunk of concrete literally fell from the sky, right? Because it you know, for the reasons that outdoor facilities wear and tear, it fell from the sky. And this, it could have been a lot worse, but we were talking about $425,000 in a lawsuit settlement that I would have loved to have utilized in actually maintaining the facility so that this didn't happen and these poor people didn't have to be injured in the first place. So the importance of maintaining these facilities goes beyond, you know, just making sure the buildings are standing up. There's a real impact and a risk associated with not doing the ongoing maintenance.
Thank you. Anyone else? Councilmember Johnston?
When you bring back the facilities needs, that's going to be an itemized data set essentially of properties, of maintenance needs historically and maybe projected in the future?
Correct.
Is it going to be with a recommendation about disposal of all those properties, or is it going to go that far, or just saying, here's a catalog, now have your discussion? Is that the scope of it?
Right. It includes a comprehensive assessment of every facility and every component within the facility, down to a fan in a rooftop unit, right? And a recommendation on preventative maintenance, and then there becomes a line, right? So everything on the right side of the line is preventative, and everything on the left side of the line is deferred. And so the effect of doing the preventative maintenance versus the catch-up and the emergency stuff. So it'll be a decision-making tool.
Cost will be there, but will there be policy ideas about what Chairperson Mendenhall mentioned was a discussion around all these assets essentially? And we've had this discussion in the golf discussion, we've had it over here, and
yeah.
I think you're discussing properties as opposed to facilities. And I think those are they're two shades of a similar topic, but I think the facilities plan, the way I understand it, would be literal city facilities that that the city doesn't have the library or the city and county building or different parks buildings, things like that, versus the fleet block, which might be a different property that the city doesn't intend to maintain because it intends to dispose of the property. I think that's a slightly different conversation, although it definitely still falls in the category of a city asset currently.
Right, it bleeds over, and I think the fleet block is a good example, right? Because even though it's not a facility that is regularly utilized by the city, there is still maintenance involved, right? You can't just shut the lights off and lock the door and walk away. So there is still maintenance involved in that facility, that entire block of buildings. The old public safety building is another example of that. And so the intent would be to show you the effect, to explain the dollars spent, the dollars required, and the effect of the decision.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we're good. Thank you.
Thanks.
We've got this set for a public hearing on January 16th. And we're going to move on to item 5, our last item, the Northwest Quadrant overview. If we could have David Litvak, Lynn Pace, and Marsha White come up. Patrick, are you going to start us off? I'm sorry, David is sitting in front of me. I'm reading that Patrick Leary wrote this memo, although I'm not sure that that's...
I think David's going to give an introduction, and then
I'm sorry,
go from there,
David.
depending on...
Madam Chair, I have been called such worse things, so...
I'm a rookie here today.
It's a little overwhelming day.
Thanks, David.
Madam Chair, we have a brief PowerPoint, just more for a visual aid. that's not popping up, and so I know staff went to grab IMS to see if they can get it going, but knowing that that time is precious, we can just go ahead and
Well,
jump in.
Let me say that we have it in our packets, and if anyone in the audience, if
Right.
it doesn't come up, if you want one, raise your hand. I'm sure our staff can wrangle some paper copies.
And I'm not, my intent, Madam Chair, is not necessarily to go through the presentation page by page, but really, again, it was meant more as a visual aid. You have a more detailed version of the PowerPoint in your packet. And really my role in introducing this, and our brilliant staff from the many different departments and divisions that are engaged in the Northwest Quadrant are here to answer specific questions. The intent of today's briefing is really to be a little bit more high level and show all the different moving parts regarding the Northwest Quadrant. The information that you have runs through a timeline. It's incredible when you step back and you look at what the administration, the council together have been able to accomplish in the last less than 2 years with the Northwest Quadrant. And it's an important perspective. We know this has a lot of great value to the city, to the residents, to the business community, and it really has been a tremendous collaborative effort and a tremendous partnership. Looking back and knowing that it will be moving forward. So just some of the timeline for your review as we go through that.
Madam Chair?
Yes?
This is exactly what I asked for, is this timeline on stuff that we've been doing. This is perfect. Thank you. This is just great. So like you said, everybody can see where we started and how we're ending up. I think that was the question that we were getting, is this dance, this runaround that we were doing. So this is really great. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And the intent was that everybody watching on Channel 17 and here would be able to see that. But at least you get to see it today.
They're working on it.
We're working on it. Also, you'll notice in the presentation just some of the key areas, 9 key areas regarding the Northwest Quadrant implementation plan. And then the PowerPoint really kind of just goes through, the presentation just kind of goes through and highlights what the key focus in each of those areas are. The one thing I just want to highlight, because it's a little bit different, is the airport. The airport becomes an important part of the conversation just because of the proximity to the Northwest Quadrant area, and as that we look at issues like planning and infrastructure and land use, we have to be cognizant of what the airport master plan is, and that we're being consistent with that we're not stepping on any toes there. So it's a little bit of a different focus there, but it's an important area. And then one thing that we haven't spoken a lot about, that's, look at that, as I get to the end. Something that we haven't spoken a lot about is just the amount of engagement with the different stakeholders that has occurred over the last year and a half or so, just in developing the vision and the work that economic development has done with all the different stakeholders, the importance of the environment and work with environmental stakeholders. And then, of course, as highlighted here, the importance of our community councils and community groups and engaging them in that conversation as well.
Could we get you to back up? We have time. At least to the infrastructure slide.
Absolutely.
For the sake of the hundreds of thousands of viewers at home.
Well, maybe I'll just kind of quickly show so everyone can kind of see that timeline.
Thank you.
Right? Again, just the importance. I'm going to move this and we're going to lose it,
And it's
right?
all going to shut down because you're doing that.
Again, I'm not going to read through that, but just the importance of, you can see what's been accomplished. There's a couple notes where on some additional work that still needs to occur. For example, the zoning, most of the work, zoning recommendations have been completed by the city council, but there are some additional issues that the administration will be bringing forward that you're aware of. And then we look at the creation of the RDA and where we are with that. And even now to where you have, it's kind of cut off in the line, but you have landowners who can now begin marketing land for development. And to the point of Councilmember Rogers, that was a goal back when we started this conversation in 2016 to reach that. So that's also, to me, when I look back at that, a high mark in terms of what we were able to achieve with the vision that was initially set out. There's those 9 key areas that we've been focusing on with the Northwest Quadrant. Again, I'll put that little asterisk next to the airport on why we're talking about the airport as it relates to the Northwest Quadrant. And as we just kind of walk through that, some of the key areas in those different buckets with planning and the zone. Again, much of the work has already been accomplished. Again, a very collaborative effort between the administration and the council. And we know that the second phase of the economic development will be completed shortly, and we look forward to bringing that to the council. I know that Laura Briefer today is going to talk a little bit more. I'm looking for a nod because I don't want to say anything wrong about the prison infrastructure. But that work continues to go forward, and we've made some great headway with the state and our negotiations with the state over the last little bit. Now, see, now it's not moving. I moved it and I killed it. Moving on the screen, but not the screen in front of me. So the screen that now is not coming up is the communications and engagement. If you look at that very last page, you can see just almost brainstorming all the different stakeholders that have been dialogued with throughout this process.
Well, there was the inland port slide right after this one.
So the inland port, is an important conversation that Laura can definitely talk more about, but is something that we're looking at in conjunction with the state, and we're waiting for the World Trade Center study that was commissioned to be released. We know that a draft has been completed, but we're waiting for the study to be finished that will further the conversation about the inland port.
But the big takeaway for me was that we are not supposed to call it an inland port anymore.
Yes, the number one recommendation, do not call it an inland port, a global trade port. And I will let Laura, if you want to know more about why, answer that, because I will flub that big time.
She's saying she's quite all right to not.
I think it has something to do with it makes it sound like we have ships that will come into the inland port.
And our transmittal broke it down pretty well. Laura, you're welcome to come up if you
flub
want to. But a global trade port,
Yeah.
never shall we call it an inland port
That,
again.
that is actually a recommendation that came out of the initial draft.
The consultant.
Laura Fritz.
Hello.
Thank you. Just need to introduce yourself.
Laura Fritz, Director of the Department of Economic Development. Pleasure to see everyone this evening. The consultants, when they completed the analysis of whether or not Utah/Salt Lake City would be a great place for an inland port, didn't feel that we had all of the tools in our toolbox to be a true inland port. However, they felt that we could be something that's sort of a hybrid of an inland port and a global trade concept. And they said it really would be pioneering, I hate to use that word, but pioneering in that it would allow us to take all the assets we do have and really be able to be successful with them. And so they want to call it a global trade area because we do have the foreign trade zone, which the city owns. We do have an existing intermodal facility. There is opportunity to expand upon our rail and transportation and our cargo at the airport. So combine all those, they felt a global trade area made more sense than just an inland port.
Thank you.
So, Madam Chair, with kind of going through that basic information, would love to open it up to questions that you may have of staff. Again, I think Laura Briefer came prepared to talk a little bit more about the prison infrastructure as well.
Laura Briefer, would you like to come on up here and give us an update on the conversation that we are riveted to? We can't leave the prison, at least from our screen.
And I did have some slides on infrastructure. Just, it's not necessary that we look at them. I think you have them in front of you. If we can get them up, great. But it's just to kind of give you a sense of the scale of what we're looking at in terms of the backbone infrastructure to the correctional facility, and then what we anticipate the infrastructure looking like as the area develops. So the city and the State Division of Facilities and Construction Management in December agreed upon the terms of a cooperative agreement for the design, construction, and ownership of the infrastructure improvements to the new state correctional facility. And that agreement provides for public utilities to take ownership of the infrastructure at the end of the day after the DFCM builds that infrastructure to the prison. And so we participated very closely with DFCM to make sure that the designs meet our existing standards for water, sewer, and drainage systems. So the attachment to the cooperative agreement is this document called a basis of design, and the basis of design is for water, sewer, drainage, and roadways and street lighting, both for the prison facility and then for ultimate build out in the future. And so the slides that I had presented just kind of gives you an idea of what the infrastructure to the correctional facility looks like, and then what ultimate build out looks like once the development of the Northwest Quadrant continues. So for instance, for water infrastructure, the infrastructure to the prison facility serves as a large part of the backbone of water infrastructure to the Northwest Quadrant. That includes a looped system, 24-inch and 12-inch water transmission lines. The full build-out includes the addition of another 24-inch water transmission line plus distribution lines to serve the interior of the properties. Similarly, the sewer infrastructure build-out, there will be force mains, 2 force main lines and 1 large pump station to the correctional facility. And then future build-out will require additional pump stations and additional lines.
Madam Chair, can I jump in here really quick?
Please do, Councilmember Kitchen.
And I'm glad Lynn is here, because I remember about 2 months ago we were talking about the sewer proposal, and there was a concern about maybe not enough redundancy being proposed. Can you talk to that issue?
Yeah, I think Laura can address that as well.
Yeah, so we resolved that issue, and we do have enough redundancy now. So to the correctional facility, there will be 2 force main lines, 1 22-inch and 1 16-inch line. And that was important to us in order for us to feel comfortable adopting this infrastructure in the long term.
So in terms of health and safety, you feel like the current negotiation is adequate?
I'm very happy with the current negotiation, yes.
Council members? Come on, James, I know you've got something for...
Well, I have a lot of questions, but I guess one of my questions is, we've been talking about transportation, and we haven't heard any, I'm just looking for rough figures, what it would be to get the tracks to go out to the International Center and to the Northwest Quadrant. I guess that's one question. We've never really heard estimates of X amount of dollars to get it there, and it's something that we should discuss and find out what the cost would be.
Ask Mike or John.
Just clarifying, are you talking about light rail tracks?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're not talking about heavy rail into the area?
No.
Okay.
No, this is for public transportation.
Okay. Yeah, we could. We don't have that information right
And
now.
I'm not looking for solid numbers. I just say estimate.
Yeah.
This is what you're looking
Okay.
at to get to that point.
Absolutely, we can definitely take a look at it. More than happy to.
Anybody else? This was a good update. Transmittal was really helpful. And I saw Vicki Bennett in the hall, and am happy to say that I feel pretty comfortable with our sustainability position on the Northwest Quadrant right now. I think our M1 updates kind of resolved some of the concerns that I had anyway. So if we don't have anything else, We will look forward to.
Madam Chair,
Lynn.
can I just add that? Just a couple of things that, this was intended to be a broad overview, but you should also be aware that there are a couple of things that will be coming to the council in the next few weeks in much more detail. One is a discussion about the adoption of a, I think it's a CRA, thank you. It used to be. Okay. Anyway, a community reinvestment area plan for most of the Northwest Quadrant. When I say Northwest Quadrant, I mean the area north of I-80, minus the landfill. And that dialogue has been ongoing. There's been significant discussions with the property owners. There's 2 major property owners in that area, and they've been exploring the development of a community reinvestment area for that property, and exploring the terms of potential development agreements with those 2 property owners. Those issues will be briefed in much more detail next week, is my understanding, but that will be coming forward to the council or the RDA board in short order. The other piece that we are continuing to work on is dialogue about the potential for further economic development in the area. And a lot of that is relating to the global trade area. Thank you. I gotta get my words right. Bear in mind, the city is not developing that. The city is the facilitator of that opportunity. But we want to make sure that the city is cooperating with the property owners, the providers, the state, and others who may be interested in creating those opportunities. We want to make sure that we are facilitating the economic opportunity that may exist there. Bear in mind that all of that is the economic development of the area north of I-80. There will be and is a separate dialogue as to the potential future and development of the landfill property itself, which is the 700 or so acres of the old North Temple landfill. So both of those dialogues are ongoing, but you should expect to get more detail on both of those items, I would say certainly in the next month or 2.
We will work hard to accommodate a rapid timeline for those as
Madam Chair,
everything
just one
we've done.
follow-up, too.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I guess the future build-out, I estimate costs on those as well, what it would cost the city on their part for the additional future build-outs, sidewalks, drainage swells, especially the water lines, I think, for me, the 24 and the 12, just what our cost would be.
Okay, so we've got 2 follow-ups from James with the build-out costs and with the UTA possible expansion into that quadrant.
I could address just that one question, Councilman Rogers. We anticipate most of the future development to be paid by developers as they enter the area. There might be some regional projects that we may want to look at in terms of splitting cost, but mostly developers. And then we've got some projects that are downstream in the sewer collection system that we're currently working on that were already part of a master plan for us.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, and Laura, correct me if I'm misstating here, but while we say that that will be paid by future development, I think that's true, but those property owners will then in turn look to the RDA and assistance from the RDA and the taxing entities to defray some of the costs of that infrastructure.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you, Lynn, David, and
Thank you.
Laura.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, that takes us on to our standing items. Report and announcements from Executive Director.
Okay. Each year at this time, we raise with you the opportunity to do mailing through the city public utilities bills. This is an opportunity for each of you to do one newsletter out to your district, piggybacking on the billing mailing. So we have the opportunity for 3 people to do a newsletter in April, August, or December. And so we need to know who would be willing to do what month.
Can I jump in here? Yeah. I'd like to do mine in December if possible.
Okay. Okay. So, no, I'm sorry, I can't.
I'll take April.
Okay.
What month do you want to do your utilities newsletter? It's that easy. Is December taken now?
No, I think we can do 3.
Okay, so we have one
Yes.
more spot there.
One more slot there. We have 3 slots in August and 2 slots in April.
Madam
We have
Chair,
more slots than we have.
I'll take
council
August again
members.
just to balance out. Yeah,
James?
I'm a man of.
What's left?
All 3, you can have April, August, or
long.
December.
Of a
Do
meeting.
August. August is good.
Okay.
Chris and Amy?
Chris, what do you want?
It means you have to work sooner on writing your newsletter.
Oh.
I want December.
Oh, okay. I was wondering. I was
Sorry, I
like,
just
there's
called
something
December.
bad
You
about
can-
April. I
No,
wanna use
no.
April.
If you're a CPA, maybe you don't want to pick April.
I'll do April.
Okay,
Great.
very good. Then the next item is the reminder for the financial disclosure. There's a copy of that with your packet, and that needs to be current annually in the city recorder's office. The next,
I don't think we got one.
didn't you?
We didn't get the printed announcement, so maybe that's
Oh,
why.
Okay, so here's the trick. It seems,
Yeah.
conflict of interest disclosure statement. Mine just happens to be on the back side of the calendar.
Ours is
Verbal.
not.
Okay, so we've tricked you. We will get this to you.
Okay.
Okay? All right. Okay, next item then is the annual calendar. We did have the previous council take a look at this because we do need to get going on it before January, but we can amend it at any time, and so we want to find out from this council whether what we've done is satisfactory or if you would like to do some changes to your calendar. Even with this adoption, you can still add meetings or change meetings. This is just a solid piece of public notice to get out at the beginning of the year. So do you want to go quickly through it? Is that okay?
Sure.
Just, so in January, we have, these are the things that typically are considered by councils. Usually you have a workshop or a retreat toward the beginning of the year. Sometimes you also do one in the fall. So there's a tentative placeholder on this calendar for the last Tuesday in January. And sometimes that retreat has, say, started like at 11 or 12 and gone into the afternoon. It'll be the body's choice of how to handle that. Usually there's a recommendation from the new chair and vice chair, but we have a placeholder. Andrew?
Does the administration know if the mayor has a date for her State of the City address yet, or a place, or any thought on that? Okay. Just didn't know if you know up front.
Could I also, at that good point, and I think that we'd like to find out if the mayor can attend potentially, or what kind of a format we've yet to decide. So if you could let us know perhaps her availability on Tuesdays in late January, that might be helpful.
Okay, all right. And then in March, for this year, we have already tentatively worked around the National League of Cities convention, and so there is not a meeting planned for that date in March. Where's it? Oh, one cannot look at January and think March. That's my problem. The 13th. So there's no meeting that night scheduled. Let's see, in April, we try to work around the Utah League of Cities and Towns, that typically doesn't conflict, but there is the Downtown Alliance trip. And that is one that really has been valuable for council members in the past. And so there may be a conflict there if you would like to fly out the night before. That seems like one we should get you more information on before we move around with the schedule. Okay, July and August, you usually, under our ordinance, you would schedule 2 meetings in July and August. Sometimes you adjust the July meeting to your personal preference so that it, maybe you want to avoid the week of the 4th of July. Maybe you want to avoid the week of the 24th. It just is whatever the group would like to do. Right now, it looks like you have no meeting on January 3rd. You have a meeting on the 10th and the 17th. You could choose to have one on the 31st. But 2 meetings is all we've ever had in
Even though
July.
we're showing tentative on the 17th and the 31st. But
That was so you could
Okay.
choose, yeah.
Great.
Do you want to choose now, or do you want to?
No.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
We wait?
Mm-hmm.
You could you could prod us
Okay.
in a little further down maybe.
All right, September is taken care of. November is, we don't have an election day problem. Typically, we have you double check the Thanksgiving holiday to see if it works for your plans. You do have a meeting Tuesday, November 20th. Thanksgiving is the 22nd. So if you wanted to, you could switch your Tuesday, November 20th to Tuesday, November 27th, if you are all hosting or traveling.
I think I'd prefer that one. Do you guys have an opinion on Thanksgiving week versus the week after? Yeah, and leave that whole week open.
Okay. All right, so the 27th, that will be the change. And that's all I have for announcements.
Thank you, Cindy. Unless Charlie has something, I don't think this chair and vice chair have anything to report. And we don't have a closed session, except David Litvak would like to talk to us. Evening. Thank you. That was quick. So that's a Wednesday. Wednesday, the 31st of January. State of the City. Great. Okay, that concludes our meeting. We'll have dinner and regroup in the formal room at 7 o'clock for our formal meeting. Thank you.